The Boarding House is the sixth short story by James Joyce, published in 1914 in the short story collection titled Dubliners. It is set in the early 1900s, in Dublin, Ireland. This realist fiction is written in the modernist tradition and is from the third-person anonymous narrative perspective. Do click the link in the description box below for more Dubliners short stories. The tale begins with Mrs. Mooney, a butcher's daughter, married one of her father's workers. Her husband turned to alcohol, wrecked their business, and became increasingly violent. He tried to kill her with a meat cleaver, so she got a separation with the priest's permission. Using money from the marriage, she opened a boarding house, where her lodgers, mostly clerks, tourists and traveling musicians, call her the Madam. Her son Jack is a clerk, a brawler and a gambler, and her Polly is a 19-year-old flirtatious girl who works at the boarding house as a housekeeper. Polly had worked as a typist but returned home when her father started troubling her at work. Mrs. Mooney overlooks Polly's flirtations at the boarding house with the male lodgers, even allowing one secret romance to grow. When she's sure the relationship with Mr. Doran, a paying guest, has gone too far for him to pull back, she decides to push for marriage. She talks with Polly to confirm the affair, then plans a Sunday meeting to pressure Mr. Doran into proposing. In the meantime, Mr. Doran is nervous, unable to shave, and haunted by guilt after confessing the affair to a priest. He doesn't know if he loves Polly and is afraid of how his family will react because of Polly's scoundrel father, mother's disreputable boarding house and Polly's bad grammar. He worries more about his job as a Catholic wine merchant and his reputation if their affair becomes public. A tearful Polly soon tells him that her mother knows, making him even more anxious. As he heads down to meet Mrs. Mooney, he passes Jack, recalling Jack's threats against another lodger over Polly. Upstairs, Polly happily daydreams about her future until Mrs. Mooney calls her to speak with Mr. Doran. Now let's look at the major themes of The Boarding House by James Joyce. In The Boarding House, religion is portrayed as a restrictive force that traps Mr. Doran into marriage through guilt and obligation. Mrs. Mooney exploits the church's teachings on sin, using marriage as a transactional solution to reparation for his affair with Polly. After confessing his sin to a priest, Mr. Doran feels overwhelmed by guilt and anxiety, trembling too much even to shave. Recollection of his confession of the night before was a cause of acute pain to him. He's almost thankful at being afforded a loophole of reparation or this chance to make amends, though it means a lifelong commitment to a marriage he doesn't desire. Joyce subtly criticizes the Catholic Church's role in the social paralysis as confession amplifies Mr. Doran's guilt, pressuring him toward a life he doesn't want. Though Mr. Doran is over 30, he has made little progress in life and will be even more trapped as Mrs. Mooney's son-in-law. Already constrained by fear of Jack Mooney and his family's opinion, he faces complete paralysis. Coming from a higher class than the Mooneys, Mr. Doran has more to lose if his reputation is damaged, but his only alternative is to abandon his job and risk an uncertain, likely poorer future. This lack of real choice exemplifies his powerlessness. Joyce doesn't show the final conversation between Mr. Doran and Mrs. Mooney because the pressures around him are so intense that it's clear he has no choice but to accept a marriage he does not want. Mr. Doran feels trapped by religion, family, and social expectations, left with no path but a discontented future. The boarding house portrays marriage as a social trap rather than a bond of love. Mrs. Mooney maneuvers to secure a respectable husband for Polly, exploiting Mr. Doran's fear of scandal and his concern for his job. Jack Mooney's reputation for violence further pressures Mr. Doran. The marriage is established on manipulation, yet Polly appears unconcerned. She's content with dreams of a secure future, knowing her mother will handle things. Polly is just as calculating as her mother, and she's not at all surprised when Mrs. Mooney calls her down to meet Mr. Doran, expecting his proposal. As a single mother and business owner, Mrs. Mooney is always cautious with her resources, viewing Polly's future as just one more practical concern to manage. After her conversation with Polly, she reviews her plans for her daughter like she secures leftover bread and butter. When the table was cleared, the broken bread collected, the sugar and butter safe under lock and key, she began to reconstruct the interview which she had had the night before with Polly. Though Mrs. Mooney does not worry as much about her own reputation, her life choices have been risky. Leaving her husband, even with the church's support, went against social expectations, and opening a boarding house, though not completely disreputable, limits respectability. The lodgers call her the Madam, a title that hints at her intent to profit from Polly's interactions with the male boarders by giving her the run of the young men. Mrs. Mooney's encouragement of Sunday parties and her tolerance of Polly's flirtations reflect a certain disregard for propriety, and the boarding house was beginning to get a certain fame that might concern Mr. Dorian's family. Mrs. Mooney's silence about the affair is also significant. She's aware of it from the start, but her focus is on securing a favorable outcome. Her outrage is mostly for show, a tactic to secure Polly's social and financial future through marriage to Mr. Dorian. She essentially uses Polly to attract a stable husband, keeping her at home to engage with the lodgers and waiting for the relationship with Mr. Dorian to reach a point where he will feel obligated to propose. While Mrs. Mooney insists that men should bear equal responsibility in these relationships, she also sees this as an easy solution to her own burden of supporting an unmarried daughter. Mrs. Mooney's goal to marry off Polly highlights the limited options for young women during the early 20th century. For unmarried women, there was the risk of scandal or the label of a burden on their families. Polly's only realistic choices are to work menial jobs like a typist or marry, but job opportunities are limited. And Mrs. Mooney knows that society harshly judges young women for any sexual relationships. She recognizes the double standard, where men can go their ways while women suffer the consequences. It is all very well for the man, he can go his ways as if nothing had happened, having had his moment of pleasure, but the girl has to bear the brunt. Hope you like and subscribe for more Dubliners short stories.